Welcome to the webinar on how to manage data as an asset, something the vast majority of businesses don't do, but if they did, they'd have far better results with a lot less waste and a lot less pain for the people who have to lead data in those organisations. I'm David Willens, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Anmut, and we enable organisations to get the best return from their data assets because we believe data-driven decisions actually work out better for everyone. I'm just going to hand you over now to Herman, our Chief Exec. He's going to talk to you about the why, how and what of managing data as an asset. Over to you, Herman.
David, thank you very much. And it's brilliant to see some well-known names that friends of Anmut and some others as well this morning. I'm going to talk about data is important, but I know there are people that really want it to be referred to in the plural. I just can't get used to it. So you either have to check out of the conference now if that's going to irritate you, but I just use the singular when I talk about data. Next slide. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because I think every organization we talk to recognizes that data is really, really important, and that the top performing organizations have significantly higher margins than the organizations that manage their data better have significantly higher margins than the ones who don't. However, there aren't that many of those organizations that are in the top quartile. And today we'll talk a little bit about that and why that is. We'll also talk about what things those organizations that are the real leaders actually do. So, but suffice to say that data, and I don't think I have to emphasize this too much, can give you significantly higher operating margin, but more importantly, actually position you strategically for your future, where organizations really need to be. So let's go to the next slide. Now, why is this so important and what's changed that it's become such a big deal? So some of you who know me would have seen me talk about this because it is something that is fundamental to understanding why the big shift in data has happened. If we look at 1975, when in IFRS, which is the International Accounting Standards, started being implemented, the way the accounting standards were set was to focus on the physical, tangible assets. Because at that stage, the context was that 83% of the market value of the S&P 500 was you could account for on the balance sheet. However, today it's vastly different. The number you see there from 2015 is even less than 13% today. So only 13% of the market value of the S&P 500 sits on the balance sheet, and in 2015, and today that number is even lower. And a significant part of the intangible value sits in data. So what we say at Anmut is that data is a significant asset for the organization, but because the accounting methods and processes misses this as an asset, it is not managed as an asset. People don't expect a return on investment in the same way that they would from financial assets or from physical assets. So David, let's go to the next one. And we all know that the tech-born companies, such as the Teslas and all the Silicon Valley companies and the unicorns that we know about, understand data. They know that data is the lifeblood of everything they do. If you think about a Tesla car, it is a phenomenal data gathering tool. The real value that Tesla will have in the future is not so much about the physical cars, but having the most advanced AI automated driving software, because it has been feeding its neural networks through all the many thousands of Tesla cars out there the whole time. And as we all know, when you connect to a supercharger, you actually download tons of data back to Tesla so that they can analyze it and learn from it. And they understand the value of data, and that is reflected in the market cap. Now, clearly the market value goes up and down based on Elon's tweets, but there is something very fundamental about their understanding. And so it is with all the other tech leaders that really get it. They understand that the data is the valuable thing. Amazon Alexa is another example. The device is not the thing that's making creating the value for Amazon. It is just a collection device for data. So if we move on to the next slide, David, this is really, really, really important. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this one just to explain the context. This is a survey by PwC, KPMG do a similar one, etc. So, and the facts are all very consistent. The vast majority of CEOs that they survey tells you that data is critical. In other words, if you look at the first number, the 95 and 94% number, those are the numbers in 2009 and 2019 that CEOs said customer data is critical to their success. However, asking them, do you actually have the data you need to execute on your customer strategy? In 2009, 21% said yes. And in 2019, 15% said yes. So actually a deterioration. And this is something we see with many organizations that aren't data-driven, is that they actually don't seem to be improving on data. They're doing a lot of analytics, they're doing a lot of dashboarding, etc., but they aren't fundamentally getting the data they need to have a strategic advantage. And you have to ask the question, well, if the market is spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year on this, why is this not getting better? So David, let's move to the next slide. So the other fact is that the problem is severe. It's not a small problem. Harvard Business Review did a study that shows that only 3% of data is acceptable for the strategic intent and the decision making. We find it varies based on the clients we work with and the data assets that we're working with, but it typically isn't much better than about 24% in most cases, some cases 6% and so on, but it's low, much lower than the leadership of organizations realize that the data is not fit for purpose. And the easiest test of that is if you ask your data scientists where are they spending their time, 80% of their time is typically spent on collecting, cleaning, and getting data into a shape to do the data science work on it. And that's pretty much true in most organizations. Now, what happens in reality is they then bend the problem to fit the data they have, rather than going back to basics and saying we need to have the data sources in order to have the strategic advantage. So let's go to the next slide, David. And the real cost is enormous. So the average organization spends around 5% of its revenue on data without realizing it. And they are incredibly inefficient. 70% of that is wasted effort. So if you think about it, for an organization that is a 5 billion pound organization, they would be spending in the range of about 250 million pounds a year on data, often without realizing it. And secondly, they are wasting 70% of that because they're inefficient with their use. And we'll unpack that in a second. So then we get to how do you actually start changing this? Well, the first thing is to know where you are. Where are you on the data maturity curve? Now, there are each consultancy has a data maturity curve. Most of it is very flaky, I have to say. And unfortunately, that gives organizations a bum steer. You do need to have a proper understanding of each of the key things that really impact your data maturity in order to make progress. So one of the key things we do with our clients is to help them understand where they are, but more importantly, what their strategy should be to improve. David, let's go to the next one. So that's, in summary, there is a real problem. Data is not being managed, and that's a fact. And that's a fact for 95% of the organizations we see. So let's take an example from another industry. This is the oil industry, a very simplified value chain for the oil industry. The problem that we see over and over and over again is that when people try and do data and analytics, they focus on 9, 10, and 11 on this slide. In other words, if you were Shell or BP and you just built fuel stations, bought a lot of transport trucks, and had some storage for the oil, that's not a viable business. That is not a viable business, and I have to emphasize that. The reason why Shell and BP became such powerful businesses is they understood that they need to understand where the oil reserves are and be very effective at ensuring they have the most cost-effective ways of extracting those oil reserves. And they needed to ensure they understood what the purpose of that oil will be so they can build refineries that is appropriate for that. The data industry is not working like that at the moment. It focuses on 9, 10, and 11. It is not focusing on where the real value is. So that is critical. And if we look at the next slide, I'll try and explain that in more technical terms. So most organizations are spending heavily on data technologies, but the areas that it focuses on is the use and access. In other words, things like analytics, storage, cloud solutions, etc., and some governance tools around that, like Calibra and so on. And they are all good tools. There's no problem with it. The issue is they are building just the end of that value chain. They're actually not clear about what data they need to be strategic, and they are wasting enormous resource. They're wasting 80% of their effort, 70 to 80% of their effort in just trying to plug the end of this value chain. So what we are saying is, if you're doing that, you will not make progress. That's the bad news. The good news is you can change the game. And what we'll talk about today is how you change that game. Okay, David. So some key questions that might be, or things that we need to think about and problems we see is that people or organizations aren't investing in the right things. We see time after time after time that systems are being replaced and there is no improvement or very little improvement. And the issue was that the problem was not the system functionality. The issue was the data is not fit for purpose. And nobody's actually described why that data should be fit for purpose and what would make it so. The second thing is there are many initiatives such as master data programs, metadata programs, etc. in organizations. That's a blanket program, and it's indiscriminate about what the most valuable data assets are for the organization, therefore wasting time and actually typically underfunded for what's required. And then the third thing is that organizations are embarking on significant digital programs. The failure rate is high. Deloitte and McKinsey have different figures for this, but it's between 6 and 30% success rate. So more than 70% failure rate of digital programs. So that is the reality of what's going on in the organizations, and I'd love to check in when we do the Q&A whether that is universal or whether it's just what we see. But the key question is, if it is a material asset, and we would argue it is it being managed appropriately? Is it being managed as an asset in the organization? So our view is the vast majority of organizations don't. And the evidence is very simple, because they're not making progress. They're getting very marginal improvements rather than exponential improvements, which they can get if they've managed their data better. Okay, so let's see how we solve it. So the way we work with organizations is you need to know where you are. You need to diagnose the problem really clearly. We track thousands of different things that an organization does, but there are about 60 categories that we typically look at that's critical, and they fall into 7 layers, if you want. The first one is, do you understand the value of your data? If not, you won't make progress. It's as simple as that. The second thing is that you actually need to understand what the value of your data asset is in relation to your other assets. and what the priority of that valuation is. But most importantly on the valuation is how the value streams of the organization ends up in the data assets. If you don't understand that, you'll be flying blind the whole time, and all of your investments will be just either luck of the draw, and it won't necessarily give you a guaranteed result. So you cannot improve the return on investment of your data materially if you do not understand the value of your data and how it gets there. The third thing is to understand really what the data condition is. So when we say data condition, we don't mean a technical data quality at the field level. What we mean is it fit for purpose at the strategy and operational level for the organization? The vast majority of organizations don't know. They don't know what would be fitness for purpose, and they don't know whether the data actually meets that. And then the fourth thing is you need to prioritize your capital investment based on the most valuable data assets for the organization. If you don't do that, you won't make progress. You'll be wasting the money that we talked about earlier. And then clearly, once you've done that, you need to start remediating, etc., but on a very focused basis, using your resources in a way that really drives difference in the organization. So I'm going to, let's go on to some examples, and then we can show. So this is one of our clients, Highways England. And if you think about Highways England, you would think, well, they do concrete infrastructure, which is very true. But did you know that data actually is critical to ensuring traffic flow and so on, clearing accidents, making sure it's safe, etc., etc. So Highways England is actually quite a progressive organization. They have a very compelling vision and strategy up to 2050. And the way we see transport emerging over the next 20 to 30 years is going to radically change. And let's think about it for a little bit. In the way they do construction, it is hugely disruptive at the moment when they do roadworks and construction. That can be significantly improved by using new construction techniques such as modular building and so on and so forth. But it requires much greater precision about the design using digital twins and so on for the design of these assets. And you also need to know exactly when to schedule the roadworks with much greater precision. If you don't have the quality data to be able to know when the roadworks are being scheduled and how they actually impact traffic flow and how you optimize it for traffic flow, you're going to have an enormous waste of effort. And that is often the reality. So Highways is on a strategy to improve that. But they're also doing some very exciting things. There is a recognition that EVs or connected autonomous vehicles will be the future. I don't think many people would argue about that. The reality is, what does it do to the capacity of the highways infrastructure? Well, regardless of whether it increases or not, by really thinking ahead and what data needs to be available, Highways England can provide much more reliable services. Highways England creates value to the extent of about 300 billion to the economy. Because the vast majority of goods travel on the Highways England infrastructure. Any delay that is caused by roadworks not being planned, etc., or not being properly communicated, causes the logistics industry significant money. For example, if Royal Mail isn't aware that the route needs to be replanned, that causes delays in mail, and the same for all the other logistics companies. So the data allows them to create extra capacity where they previously had to build extra infrastructure. So they can now get a much better return on the investment on £1 of data investment versus £1 of concrete investment. So we'll come back to that in the discussion, but the reality is they now understand how they get better return on their data, but it doesn't come for free. And that is the important thing. The data needs to be managed in order to deliver that. Okay, David, let's go to the next one. So this is just a snapshot of the type of detail that we go into to understand the maturity of an organization. But the reality is that most organizations in the FTSE 100 are actually in the 2 to 3 range of data maturity, which means they are wasting enormous amounts of money. Let's go to the next one, David. And this is the data valuation slide. So I'm going to pause here for a second, because not understanding the value of your most material data assets and the priority of those data assets will lead you to take wasteful decisions in the organization. What you have on the right-hand side are the data assets of Highways England. And what you have just left of that are the key value drivers that flow into those data assets. And those value drivers come from what the stakeholders of Highways England value. So the data asset is an avatar of the value of Highways England. And that is true for any valuation that we do for a company. It's not a made-up number. It's not an accounting number. It is looking at the economic value that the organization creates for the investor, for the employee, for the customer, for the supplier, and encapsulating that economic value through the key value drivers of the organization into the data asset. And this decodes the value pathways in the organization for you. Once you know that, you have the map for making decisions. So the organizations that we work with use this map for board level decisions constantly, not just around data projects, but everything they do now, because they understand how value flows through the organization, through their own value chain, and how these things connect. And then it becomes clear that data is the thing that powers the digital economy. So organizations who don't have this are flying blind. Okay, next one. And this is just an example of the Highways England data. This is the real data valuation. Their strategic road network model is worth around 5 billion. And you have some of the others there as well. What this gives them is the ability to understand what the most valuable data assets are. Now, why is this important? Up to this point, they did not realize that the strategic road network model is their most valuable data asset, because it was managed as 32 different systems. People wanted to make changes to a system in an uncoordinated, unarchitected way without realizing it's all connected. And that is true for most data assets. Many of these things don't just sit in one system or one process or one boundary of the organization. They sit all over the place. And the only way to have that visibility is to link it back to the value that it creates for the organization.
Thanks, Herman. And this is a recording. On a live webinar, we always have a very lively Q&A discussion. If you want to take part in that, you need to join us on a live version. You'll find details of when we're running those webinars on our website. So all that's left to say really from me is thank you. Thanks for listening. And if you want to know more about managing data as an asset, please get in touch.